the story sort of begins, let's say, in about 1929, when shop manager Fred H. Offenhauser is working for Harry Miller. He's running the Miller Engine Company with Harry Miller. In 1929, the stock market crash drives Miller into bankruptcy, into financial peril.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if there was an official bankruptcy, but he goes into financial peril. And the Offenhauser family, Fred H. Offenhauser, and I think his cousins, uncles, they put together enough money and finance to buy Miller out. And so in 1930, roughly, the Miller engine, racing engine, becomes the Offenhauser racing engine. And immediately, almost, they begin winning at Indy and winning on circle tracks, because at that time, circle track racing and what I think is, midget racing was huge. And Offenhauser race engines were a standard in that for a generation, right? From 29 or 30, winning Indy almost every year into the mid or late 60s. And I'm sure people out there know the exact details, but there's no questioning that Offenhauser at the time was known as the greatest name in racing. So Fred H. Offenhauser's nephew takes an interest in the business and in being a machinist, and in the 20s starts as a teenager, like a 12 or 13-year-old, starts working at the engine factory. He essentially stops going to school in the 8th grade and begins his education, his apprenticeship at the engine plant, and goes through, and we have essentially a written letter from Fred H. Offenhauser about his nephew, Fred Charles Offenhauser, our founder. And at the point in time when he's leaving to go in the Navy for World War II, the uncle writes him essentially what is like a CV, like a resume that almost lists what he's learned in his apprenticeship, machining, designing. All this is listed in a letter that he can show as his almost a diploma of apprenticeship, signed by the uncle, the founder, not the founder, but the namesake of the Indy Racing Motor Company. So after the war, the circumstances change, and the engine company ends up getting sold to Louis Mayer and Dale Drake. Louis Mayer stays with the group for a while, but ultimately leaves to go work for Ford's racing engine and works for Ford Motor Company in the capacity of getting them into the race engine business. Dale Drake continues running the business, and Fred Charles Offenhauser, our founder, says, "Hey, Uncle, what happened? I thought I was taking over." Well, things changed and I sold the company, but you have the name. So out of that transaction was born this consumer products company, right? The knowledge learned at the engine plant, the design, engineering, machining, metallurgy, aluminum, was all something that our founder, Fred Charles Offenhauser, showed up and started making flathead heads and flathead intakes. And our first product was our flathead head. And so Offenhauser was out in the lakes, putting his stuff on original hot rods, working on expanding the performance aftermarket parts industry. Eventually, Offenhauser and others, Edelbrock, were founders of SEMA, Specialty Equipment Manufacturers Association, which started here in SoCal but became a major industry organization. And so that the part of that I love the most is how it connects to what set the United States apart, which, in the war, and the can-do attitude, the engineering mindset, the mechanical mindset that came out of World War II was brought to bear, especially in the specialty equipment business. You had a lot of guys that came back from the war. They learned how to weld, they learned how to machine, they learned how to, fix a tank on the battlefield. They come back and what are they doing? They're building hot rods. I think Fred Offenhauser embodies that almost better than anyone else. So starting in 1946, we come out with flathead head, flathead intake, and immediately we begin producing endless stream of parts, and that went on from 46 to just about 1986. Offenhauser equipment produced parts for every automobile platform sold in the United States. Not for every company, not every single engine platform, but every major market innovation that came out from the late 40s until the early 80s, Offenhauser was addressing. That includes Toyota, Datsun, Chevrolet, and Ford. So we addressed every V8 platform from the mid 50s on. When General Motors came out with the Chevy V8, 5 blocks were sent to Offenhauser so that Offenhauser could begin the process of building aftermarket parts for that engine platform. And General Motors sent those to, and you gotta love SoCal hot rodders. In the 50s, the first thing they did was take one of those engine blocks, build a motor, and put it into the Smokin' White Owl drag car. The Smokin' White drag car was the original rear engine drag car and was the inspiration to Don Garland's. Ollie Morris, who was Fred Offenhauser's engineer, who was the owner of the Smokin' White Owl, actually was one of the most innovative hot rodders and drag racers in the 50s, in the early 50s and late 40s. So that same story, here you are, guys come back from the war, they've got knowledge, skills, abilities, and what do? They work with a large corporation like GM. The first thing they do is head out to the drags. That's like the greatest thing. I mean, everybody who hot rods, everybody who builds cars, everybody can relate to that. And I think that's what we're all reaching back to. Starting in the mid 50s, Fred Offenhauser also undertook incredible sales efforts. He had his parts, and he also became a dealer and operated a catalog company, much like Summit Racing today or Speedway today. Fred Offenhauser and Offenhauser Sales Corporation were first in wholesale dealing of not just our parts, but every brand at the time. And so through the 60s and up until 1968, we were the largest wholesaler of aftermarket equipment. In 1968, things started to change in the market. More wholesalers, larger wholesalers, Warshawski, J.C. Whitney, Keystone. There were a bunch of large-scale wholesalers at the time, and Fred Offenhauser decided to focus on only selling the parts that he manufactured. So our catalogs from 68 and later only feature Offenhauser parts. And the legend is that the warehouse here, up until the 1990s, was jammed, stuffed full of all this new old stock. So some of it, a few little pieces of it still remain. And in 1968, we were the largest intake manifold developer, if you will, in the US. We were bigger than Edelbrock, we were bigger than Wyand, bigger than Moon Eyes. And we were doing contract work for Carroll Shelby. From 67, 68, 69, all Shelby intakes were manufactured here. We did not cast them. The castings came here and we machined them and delivered them to LAX to Shelby. And there are 4 Shelby FE intake castings that were left here and collected dust and are still here. So those are little pieces of history that we touched, and there's There's plenty of documentation of all the orders from Shelby, that all that files, all those things were saved and kept. So the Offenhauser family had almost right at this point, now it's 2022. We're almost at 100 years of Offenhauser in the racing and automotive parts manufacturing business. So in 2029, Offenhauser will celebrate its 100th anniversary. So that's what the essence of the brand is. That's why we got involved with the brand. And today, the Offenhauser family is still involved in the company. Chris Offenhauser, who is the grandson of Fred Charles Offenhauser, our founder, is now on our board of directors and is involved in the company and is a huge supporter. He today is an engineer, works for Boeing, but still the engineering spirit in the Offenhauser family tradition continues on. So we've been, myself, my father, and a small group of business partners, Dan Marvin, who is Ollie Morris's grandson, all have teamed up to keep the Offenhauser name and tradition alive. We still manufacture the original vintage parts in our original factory here where we are today. These buildings were built in 1960. We had several buildings down the street. We moved into this modern facility in 1960 where we still remain. Some of the same machines, all of the same patterns. Nothing about Offenhauser is a repop. Nothing. There's no reproductions here. Everything that you see, every Offenhauser part you buy is cast off the match plates in the United States and machined on the same machines that Fred Offenhauser bought in the 50s, 60s, 70s, the same drill rigs, some of the same toolboxes that we see in photos from the 40s are just sitting here working as if nothing ever changed. So as the entire American industrial complex was offshore, Offenhauser remained standing here in the same location, pouring the same metal into the same patterns and building the same kind of horsepower we always did.